You're one of those people who have started off to say, I'm going to read the Bible through in a year, and you start reading through the Old Testament, there are times, aren't there, where you scratch your head and you think, what in the world am I supposed to get out of this passage? There are a number of passages like that in the Old Testament, and I think when we come back and we remind you again of our philosophy, we take the verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11. It says, these things happened as examples for us. They were written down to warn us who live at the end of the age. In other words, when we're reading the Bible, there are some things that are just designed to teach us about God. There's things that are designed to teach us about God's chess game, as it will, as to how he put the plan of redemption into process. And we're going to see that especially with the life of Joseph. But sometimes he writes down what happened to real people, and even things that weren't good, for the express purpose of giving us the opportunity to learn from their mistakes or to build on their successes. And so sometimes when we read these stories, like we're going to do today with Joseph, we look at his life and we say, what is it that we can learn from Joseph that will help us grow in our Christian faith? And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at this great story. Let me jump right into this with verse 2 of Genesis 37. This is the account of Jacob and his family. Now, the truth is that the story of Jacob and his family, in some respects, Jacob fades at this point, and Joseph really takes up center stage for the rest of the book of Genesis. When Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wife, Bilhah and Zilpah. So what we've got here is we've got a blended family. Even though they all grew up in the same household, this is a blended family. There's 4 different moms in this family. Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers or his half-brothers were doing. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word about him. This is an illustration of what not to do. Do not play favorites in your household. Now, that's really hard to do. And if you get any family together, and I'll do this sometimes when I'm sitting down with a family, so which child was the favorite? And you'd be surprised how many times everybody points to exactly the same person. They all know who the favorite person was. Now, some of that is that it's a lot easier for us to connect with some of our kids than others, right? That some of your children have interests that are very similar to yours. And so it's easy to relate to them. And for that child that's got really different talents, sometimes that's a real challenge to you. You go, I'm not sure how to relate to this child. That's normal. The problem is when you start obviously catering to one person over the other. Now, what's interesting here, isn't it? That this is Jacob doing this. And Jacob should have known from his own experience. You remember Jacob? When he was born, he was a twin, Jacob and Esau. And Dad loved Esau more than Jacob. Mom loved Jacob more than Esau. And so he grew up always wanting his father's approval. So is he overcompensating here, or has he just forgotten how painful that is to feel that you don't fit in? Especially in a blended family like this is, there's always that sense of, will the other parents love me as much as they love their own children? Right? Some of you maybe came up in that situation. There's always that sense of maybe I don't quite fit in. And that's what's happening here. Now, Jacob makes it worse by advertising this. And so what he does is maybe some of you have been to the musical, Joseph in his Technicolor dream coat. So his dad gets him this fancy coat, which in a sense is like a billboard that says, loved more than others, loved more than others. And that coat apparently had some kind of authoritative power to it that put him in a management position. And they already didn't like him because he was ratting on them. Any bad thing they did, he went home and tattled to daddy. And so that's not real popular. And these brothers that he's working for were actually older than he was. And so that makes it even tougher. The 17-year-old is now being put in a position of authority over us. We don't like that. And so you're building by this simple act. It was a generous act. It was a kind thing that he was doing for Joseph. But in showing favoritism to his son, he created conflict within his family. And so the challenge for us as parents is to realize that each child is special in God's eyes. Each child is given special gifts. And our job is to figure out what it is that that child is good at and encourage them in that, even if it means that you and I have to go sit down and start reading books on a subject to go, I have no idea what this is about. Somehow we need to find a way to find that cherished part of our child and celebrate it. Jacob didn't do that. Now, as we continue in the story, we find out that Joseph actually didn't help things. One night, Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. We said, well, that doesn't seem very nice. Then you listen to the dream. Listen to this dream, he said. We were out in the field tying up bundles of grain. Suddenly my bundle stood up. Your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine. Now, we might say he had no idea what that meant. Well, his brothers did. His brothers responded, so you think you will be our king, do you? Do you actually think you will reign over us? And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way he talked about them. Later on, we're going to find out that one of the things that Joseph was really good at was interpreting dreams. So you get the impression here that Joseph knew exactly what that dream meant, and now he's kind of throwing it in the face of his brothers. Soon, Joseph had another dream, and again he told his brothers about it. Listen, I have had another dream, and you can almost hear the guys going, oh, this kid and his dreams. The sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed low before me. This time, he told the dream to his father as well as to his brothers, but his father scolded him. What kind of dream is that, he asked. Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? See, we've got the advantage. We know, many of us know the rest of the story. And we know the answer to that is, yep. But they didn't. But while his brothers were jealous of Joseph, his father wondered what the dreams meant. So here's the general principle. Sometimes it's better not to share everything. This was not a good idea. Listen to this quote from Alistair Begg. Alistair writes, it's almost easier to get demoted in your work than to get promoted. For when you get promoted, it reveals the character of the people around you. It's hard for people to come to you and say, I'm so pleased that you got this wonderful promotion ahead of me, and I'm glad that you are now above me in the pecking order. Yeah, that doesn't go well. That doesn't work for most of us. And so when he's up there bragging and throwing this in their face, they're burning inside. Who does this kid think he is? And so the message there is that we need to be very careful about bragging. The Bible tells us that pride comes before the fall, and it warns us that we should be people who are humble. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have good experiences and we don't have great victories and things that we would like to share with people, but I think we always need to do so in this humble sense that look at what God has enabled me to do. This is not me. This is not a verdict on me being better than anybody else. This is just a gift of God's grace. And you would have thought that Joseph would have come and said, what do you think this dream is about? How in the world could this ever happen? And that tone would have changed everything. And you know that there are people who are always throwing things in your face, right? And you just get so tired of it. Yeah, I'm making this much money now, and I did this, and I did that. And a lot of those people are doing that because they feel insecure, but it's still irritating, isn't it? And so the lesson here is if you want to have a nice family, don't do that. And then the third thing here is we see a warning about the destructive power of envy. Now, I'm not going to read all the rest of the text, but you remember the story as Rick was reading it. So Joseph is sent out to check on his brothers, and his brothers see him coming. How did they recognize him? His coat, right? Oh, here comes Rainbow Coat Boy, you know? And so they see him coming from a distance, and immediately as they see that coat, it's a trigger. Oh, here he comes. This is trouble. Let's just take him. I mean, we know how much they hated him. Let's just take him and kill him. So they've got this big plot. Reuben, the oldest, says, oh, let's not do that. Now, the text tells us that Reuben's idea was, let's just throw him in the cistern. I'll come back later after everybody cools off. We'll pull him out, and everything will be fine. But his argument is, we don't want to be guilty of actually killing him, so let's just throw him in the cistern, and then he'll just die naturally. Doesn't that sound like the kind of thing brothers would say? Yeah. This is a good idea. Then we can say, we didn't kill him. Who threw him in the cistern? We don't know. So now, I have a question in this text. So this is the plan. This is Reuben's plan. Now they're sitting down for dinner, and they see these Ishmaelite, Midianite traders coming along the line, and Judah says, hey, I got an idea. Why throw him in there when we could make some money off of this? We could sell him as a slave, we pocket the cash, and we have the satisfaction of knowing that old King Boy is now a servant to somebody else. Wouldn't that be fantastic? Now here's my question. Where was Reuben? He missed dinner. What was he doing? Fixing a flat on the Jeep? I don't know what he was doing. Because it says later he comes back, goes to get his brother out of the cistern, and he can't find him. Where was Reuben? Now, the Bible doesn't answer that question. I'm just asking it because I'm wondering how this all fits together. It doesn't make any sense to me. So here's what's happening. Now, what we don't see is what's happening with Joseph. What's going on with Joe during this time? Is he screaming in the cistern? Is he pleading with his brothers? Is he repentant? I don't know. But all I can think of is the terror and the horror of seeing the anger in the face of your family members and realizing that you are all alone. And can you imagine that sense of disbelief as he's actually being sold to these people? Now, the rest of the story is pretty impressive. That what we see here is that God is moving chess pieces, and he finally ends up in Pharaoh's court. But for now, what we want to see is this problem with envy. These brothers envied the position that Joseph had. They envied the relationship he had with their dad. John Ortberg, who's a pastor and a psychologist, he wrote this: envy is disliking God's goodness to someone else and dismissing God's goodness to me. In other words, we lose perspective. Envy is anti-community. It is dangerous because it is opposed to other people. Sins like greed and lust are simply about the gratification of my desires. Envy not only seeks self-gratification, but it seeks to diminish the one I envy. In envy, I seek to sacrifice the other for the sake of myself. In other words, envy is kind of like an active hatred. It is when you envy what another person has and you start to hate them because of what they have. And this is an epidemic in our society. I mean, don't we see this? We see this, for example, in politics. Whichever party it is, whoever it is that has the power is envied by the other side, and the other side says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make sure that we become an obstacle so that those people can never succeed at what they do. Because if they succeed, we'll never get back into power. And so we end up in a country that's in gridlock, right? That's what's happening. We see it in families when a will is opened up. And one family member feels that they're being cheated. They're not getting the same. They're not getting an equal amount. They're not getting the same as the other members of the family, even though what they are getting is a gift, right? We see this in schools where, we envy a starting football player or a starting basketball player, whoever it is, so much so that some parents envy that so much that they will take action to get rid of one of those children. We see it in the workplace. Because of envy, we know we're not going to get promoted, and we're going to make every effort to make sure that our friends don't get promoted, even if we have to make up stuff about them. You see it in terms of relationships with other people. I envy the way that person looks or the smarts that that person has, so you start to hate them. And you start to undermine them everywhere you go. And that's what goes on with envy. It is a horrible thing. Now, it also happens among Christians. It happens in churches. There are people who say, I think I'm not getting the same amount of attention as this person's getting in the church. I don't have the same amount of power that this person has in the church. I think I should be in that position. And so people just leave churches. They start conflict. They start whispering about each other. And you know, envy's even a problem with pastors. You see some other church that's doing really, really well, and you start saying, that should be us. Why shouldn't we be the people that are having all those people come there? So what do? We start slandering other churches, which accomplishes nothing except to diminish the cause of Christ. So the question is, how do we recognize this in ourselves? Here's a few things. Here's a few clues that envy is starting to take a hold of your life. Anytime somebody has a positive comment made about them, oh, so-and-so, they're just such a nice person, do you find yourself saying, yeah, but what's going to come next is you trashing this person because maybe you envy them? Is it possible that you are always critical about somebody that everybody else admires simply because you envy them? Is it possible that anytime somebody's telling a story about something that's happening to them, a good story, went on this vacation, it was fantastic, and you have to interject, oh yeah, we did that once, and you've got to change the subject so that you are the hero of the story? Do you find it necessary to rain on everybody else's parade? And here's a tough one. We've got to be really honest. We'd never admit this out in public, but do you find a perverse pleasure sometimes when somebody that was high up, somebody that's in a good position, somebody that's been admired, falls? Oh, it's terrible. We would never do that. But inside, that envy is starting to eat us alive, and it's turning us into vicious people. So how do we combat that if you see that? Well, first, you've got to recognize it. Envy hides. It's easy to excuse envy. It's easy to divert people's attention. But we've got to be honest with ourselves. Is it possible that this is about envy? That this is not about what God is doing in my life, it's resenting what He's doing in somebody else's life? Second, we need to pursue contentment. You know what contentment is? Contentment is recognizing that we have been blessed way more than we deserve. And as long as you're focusing on your blessing, you don't notice. You don't start measuring whether their blessing's better than mine. I'm just so grateful for the blessing that I have. Why should I rain on somebody else's parade? I have been blessed beyond all measure. And so have you, whether you realize it or not. And then maybe we should take some time to really work at celebrating and affirming other people. Do you ever do that? Do you ever draw attention to positive things that other people are doing? See, a lot of times we don't do that because we don't want to put the spotlight on them, because if the spotlight is on them, where is it not? Says the boy who stands in the spotlight right now. That's the problem, right? So maybe if we would start putting our attention on looking for the strengths and the victories and the accomplishments of other people and celebrating those things with them, there's a whole lot less time to whine about what we're not getting. Isn't it fun? Let me just say, it's fun to go in and say, what can I affirm in another person? And I don't know about you, but people come up to me sometimes and say, oh, we went on this great vacation. And I'm thinking, oh, I wish I could do that. But I don't feel the need to rain on their parade. I would rather live vicariously through them. What was it like? How was this? Tell me about the food. What did it taste like? Oh, that's fantastic. Why not share in their experience? That's way better than envy, which feels like we need to destroy other people. My point here is that this story of Joseph is a story that is more tragic. It's really a story about warnings. It warns us about jealousy. It warns us about pride. It warns us about envy. But here's the thing I want you to see. In this story, nobody's happy. Nobody is. Joseph isn't happy. He's heading off with the Midianite traders to some foreign country. Do you really think the brothers were happy? No. Getting rid of their brother did not help them at all. And this just leads to nothing. So let's make note of that. 4 things that I want to leave with you. 1, we need to work to cherish each child for who they are and not what we would like them to be. 2nd, we learned that we should give thanks for the good things that happen in our life, but we should guard to make sure it doesn't go to our head. We don't have to trumpet in front of other people. We just give thanks to God. 3rd, we need to look out for envy because we need to resist it, especially when we use it to motivate. Well, you ought to be more like your brother because your brother had all. That's not a good thing with the kids. Your brother was such a good student. You should be more like your brother. You know what happens? I hate my brother. Because now everybody expects me to be like my brother. I hate when that. I'm not like my brother. So don't use it as a motivation. When you use envy as a motivator, it's kind of like poisoning the food supply to get people to think more carefully about what they eat. That's a dumb thing to do. The collateral damage is much worse than what you're trying to accomplish. And finally, this is a story that is designed not to pick us up, but it's designed to warn us that the devil is working in all kinds of ways to unravel us as people. And we can learn from Joseph, or of course, we could always learn the hard way. Let's pray. Father, sometimes we read these accounts and we just shake our head and think, my gosh, these people were awful. Until we start seeing those traits in us. And then we justify. Then we say, well, it's not the same thing, even though it is. So help us, Lord, to be delivered from pride, envy, prejudice. Help us to stop ranking people and start treasuring people. Help us to stop measuring people by ourselves and instead celebrate the fact that we can know your grace in a variety of ways. Lord, we thank you for Joseph's story. We thank you for the testimony that even in tough situations like that, you can bring redemption and healing and reconciliation. Help us to find the same in our lives, that we might truly come to love each other, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. We're to conclude today.